My name is Victoria Panova, and I'm the moderator for today's session on reimagining Bretton Woods. We're hosting today a very interesting set of speakers who are very knowledgeable and also could shed some light on where we are going, what is the role of the dollar, how much the current Bretton Woods institutions would be able to adapt to current challenges and live up to the expectations, which they failed consistently, in fact, so far. And we saw it with their numerous crises ongoing, take it 20 years back, 30 years back. So we need something new. There are some BRICS proposals. There is a BRICS created new development bank, contingent reserve arrangements. There are talks of their new financial payment system that could be introduced in order to hedge some risks and offer more alternatives to the world. But it would be really good to hear from our prominent speakers on what is their vision of where do we go. So today with us we have Philip Pilkington, Senior Research Fellow at the Hungarian Institute of International Affairs, and John Peng, Senior Fellow of the Belt and Road Initiative Caucus for Asia Pacific, Malaysia. Welcome. And Philip, the first question is yours. So what's your idea? How relevant is Bretton Woods? Can we continue just with the dollar as a reserve currency as a viable option?
I think there's pretty strong evidence now that the dollar is not going to be the reserve currency for very long. I think the time horizon on it is actually probably quite short now, potentially the end of the reserve currency by maybe 2030. That might sound quite strange, maybe quite extreme, but we've got increasing signals of this, especially since Trump's Liberation Day policies, his tariff policies. Of course, the fall of the dollar as a reserve currency goes back to the seizure of the Russian reserve assets. I think everyone knows that now. But I think the markets were in limbo for a little bit, and Liberation Day kind of pushed the markets over the edge. And so we're seeing a lot of technical indicators that the dollar is losing its status as a reserve currency. I'll just say one or two, just so people have a sense. The reason the gold price is so high is because central banks are buying up gold, and that's because they're not buying dollars anymore. Another indicator is that usually when equity markets go down, US dollar goes up and US borrowing rates go down, and that's called the flight to safety in financial markets. That's gone. Another indicator that's gone is usually when interest rates are high in the US, the dollar strengthens. Not anymore. So all these things from a financial markets background, I have a financial markets background myself, indicate that something has gone significantly wrong, or it's in US dollar markets. They're just not operating as they used to. There's plenty of murmurs that the US dollar reserve currency status is finished. Both, the Atlantic Council put out something on it. Stephen Moran, who was the the head of the chairperson of economic advisors to the president, has questioned the role of the reserve status. You can find it on the White House website now. So all the forces seem to be militating that that the US dollar is not going to be the reserve status. Just one more I saw on Bloomberg yesterday, a report that exporters were asking for alternative currencies rather than the dollar now. So it's really getting real. And so the question, I think, is mainly on the American side. What do the Americans want to do with this? They've ignored it now for some time. I wouldn't say they've completely ignored it. I think some people on the Trump economic team understand it. Stephen Moran does understand it. I think Scott Bessent understands the problem as well. And I think there's some people at the State Department as well who understand the problem. But they haven't made a decision on what to do about it. And to my mind, unless something significant changes soon, they have two choices. They can either let the US dollar adjust by the market, which could be quite violent, actually, and it could have major ramifications for the United States economy, or they can take a more managed approach. And I think that's where the question of some sort of new Bretton Woods system comes in. But perhaps that kind of raises the issue rather than tackling it for the moment.
Okay, thank you, Philip. John, now to you. Philip has mentioned that one of the key ramifications so far was about their, sanctions against Russia and how SWIFT was used and the allowance to use dollar. But we know, and in fact, this was a wake-up call for many countries around the world because they understood this could be applied to them easily. So it's not a common good. It could be used as a weapon, and it's a problem. But we know from history that there was a gradual set of problems that were bringing up the issue of the use of dollar as such. And Philip mentioned that there is understanding in some part of administration of Trump. So we are living in the age of acceptance probably, but how much U.S. administration would be reacting to that. And we know Trump was quite rigorous about that. But so what's the history behind that? Because it's a long-term problem, and it's not just about the recent events that brought the problem of dollar on site.
It certainly, thank you very much. It certainly isn't a phenomenon that just popped up. It's the dollar system as we have it is based on a system of international order, and it's almost the basis of that international order. And it's coming apart as that order is coming apart. But in Asia, for example, people are very familiar with what happened in the 1997-98 crisis as a result of dependency on the dollar. It put an end to an extraordinary period of growth for an entire set of countries that in fact have not recovered from that. These crises have long-term consequences. I'm talking about countries like Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand. So that crisis is remembered there to an extent that it's underestimated outside. So there's, I think, very strong awareness of the limitations of the dollar system and that this can't go on forever. I think what's been quite unexpected is almost the self-sabotage of the system, the resort to the seizure of Russian reserves, the weaponization of SWIFT. There you see that it's not just a problem of the end of the structure, the international order, the unipolar order underlying the dollar, but a crisis of competence in the management and credibility in the management of this. So that has been quite shocking, and I think it's accelerated the decline. I'm not sure any of us expected to be sitting here, right, at this point, talking about 10 to 20 years to the end of the dollar system, the dollar's reserve currency status. But here we are. Nevertheless, we're in this limbo state because people have invested, so to speak, so much in the dollar system and depend so much on the depth of the capital markets around the dollar, right? Global trade is based on this, and the dollar has an unmatched depth and liquidity. So there's no, people like to say there's no alternative to this. Where is it? Despite, particular piecemeal moves in BRICS, and these are important, we haven't set up, people don't see a path forward. And I think, of course, Philip is going to talk to us about a proposal, and indeed it's a proposal with a great intellectual pedigree. In ASEAN, people do talk about Malaysia, China, for example, Malaysia, Indonesia, about own currency trade. So that's on. But a systemic solution is some way away. So we're in a kind of limbo about where we go next.
Yeah, very right. In BRICS, for example, national currencies used reached 90% already, and this is quite interesting. You also mentioned the competence of the leadership of international organizations like IMF,
Absolutely.
like World Bank. And I remember back in 2008, 2009, during the crisis when there was a renewed wave of like, how should we go on? So why there should be leadership just from one set of countries and it's not open to the rest? The idea, and people were complaining, you were telling us 10 years before that other countries cannot be seen as candidates for leadership because we had problems and you knew better, so you could direct us. Nowadays, or 2008, they were saying, we have the problem primarily, so only we can decide on that. And the leadership problem still stays there. And as such, the whole problem of institutions, because they are underlying for this problem. So could they be altered at all? How, or do we need new institutions, or could those adapt? Is it just a question of leadership, or it's more systemic? And I know you had some interesting proposals. Maybe you also could lay it down for us.
Yeah, I think the two things are related. So we need to go into a tiny bit of history here. When the Bretton Woods systems were being set up in 1944, at the end of World War II, they were negotiated at Bretton Woods in New Hampshire by John Maynard Keynes and Harry Dexter White, the British and the American delegates, respectively. John Maynard Keynes wanted a multilateral system, and actually, interestingly, the multilateral system probably would have ended up including the Soviet Union, but it wasn't. Britain wanted a multilateral system as well because they were in debt, heavily in debt because of the war. The Americans wanted a dollar-backed system, and that's what we ended up with. Keynes warned them at the time that it was a mistake, and once the American economy stopped running trade surpluses, it would wish that they hadn't taken on the dollar as the reserve currency. Turned out to be right. By the 70s, they had to go off the gold standard, and we've been in a strange period of fiat currency since, which has led to the deindustrialization of the United States and the hollowing out of its economy. Basically, this is what Stephen Moran actually said in a speech that was so controversial. So that's the history of those institutions. The IMF and the World Bank were actually designed on Keynes's plan, but then at the last minute they kind of switched out the multilateral arrangement for a US dollar arrangement. So in theory, those institutions can be reformed. Around some sort of multilateral system. Now, Keynes also notes, I read the papers from 44, and Keynes also notes that it will be absolutely fine if there wanted to be regional partners as well, like BRICS. He actually envisaged something like that for the Europeans, I think, at the time, and that they might even have their own bank institution that's tied at under the IMF or as a partner with the IMF or something like that. So there's a million different relationships you can come to. But the two questions here are institutional and political at the moment. So the institutional question, I think you kind of raised it. Are these institutions actually trustworthy anymore? Is the IMF trustworthy anymore? Is the World Bank trustworthy anymore? They've lost an awful lot of trust in the world. I think the IMF in the past few years has actually not been so bad. I think it's been calling bulls and strikes pretty objectively, actually. I'm not usually a defender of IMF policies, but I think actually in the past couple of years with all the economic chaos, it's been fairly clear-headed, and it hasn't tried to manipulate data or anything like that. It could have around some of the tensions that we've had. So I would say that there's some. I think that reflects the fact that the institutions had to eat crow, as they say in America, a little bit. But it's ultimately, can they get a sufficient trust if they wanted to do it around the IMF? You could just set up a completely alternative institution, but I wouldn't. I'd say try and use the IMF first of all. Anyway, the proposal, the bank or the multilateral proposal, effectively uses kind of a mechanism like special drawing rights that the IMF already has. So it wouldn't be that hard to build it into the architecture. So personally, I think reuse the institutions. But if they've lost a sufficient amount of trust in the developing world, then that would have to be negotiated. But the political question is the real one, and that's that in order to make this decision, I think the decision will actually have to be made on a bilateral basis between the Chinese and the Americans, effectively, because they're the ones that run the big trade imbalances, and they're the two economies that are going to have to do the main adjustment. Everyone else can kind of go along.